For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Mali. Joining me today is poet Afzal Moolla to discuss his latest book, Struggle, Exile and Love. So, you were born in exile in Delhi. Can you just give us some background into your life growing up, what you remember of those times? Because you grew up in a family of freedom fighters.
Yeah, that's right. I always like to say that I wasn't born in exile. I was born because I was never in South Africa. So I was born. My parents were born in exile. I just happened to have been born while they were in exile. So, but it was I was born in Delhi. Spent a whole lot of time in Delhi, in Egypt, in back to Delhi, in Finland. This was, of course, where my dad was deployed as an ANC chief representative from time to time. So growing up in exile for me was always the stories about home, the stories about the struggle, the stories obviously growing up in an ANC home. It was all all that I ever knew about and all that I ever heard about was the struggle against apartheid. As I grew up, uh, the um, the stories of my family, my brother and my sister, whom unfortunately didn't and couldn't join us in exile. So my mom and dad were separated from my elder brother and my elder sister for almost 27, 28 years. And they were brought up by my grandparents in, in, uh, in, uh, in Johannesburg. And it's caused quite a lot of trauma in the family. My recollections of exile have been moving around from place to place, often at a very short notice, a week or two, and trying to fit in here and there. You know how it goes when one is young and tries to move from place to place, learning languages, unlearning languages, etc., etc. So, and then of course the memories of the MK cadres that used to visit us, that stayed with us. Um, well, I had two single beds in my room. I can barely remember the one bed ever being empty. There's always a South African student or an MK cadre or or someone from the movement who was staying with us at the time. So these are my earliest childhood memories. Of course, going forward, once I was growing up and in my teens, etc., that's when I started to appreciate more the situation about when it came to apartheid and what it really meant. Because as a young chap, you don't really manage to appreciate it. But as I grew up in my teens and later, of course, with my dad attending meetings and reading up more, and of course, since I was knee high, the stories of Comrade Walter Sisulu, Bram Fisher, Nelson Mandela, Ahmad Kathrada, all of the greats, Oliver Tambo, they were hewn into my blood, and so that was growing up in exile. Even though I was just born in exile, but whenever I thought about it, home was wherever I was at that time. So that's it. Yeah.
And can you tell our viewers about your book, Struggle, Exile and Love? And this was actually published recently by the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation.
That's absolutely right. It's I've been, as you know. First of all, I have to thank you personally and my brother Kenneth for being absolutely steadfast when no one would publish my scribbles, as I call them. I knew I could always count on Polity to put them up, and I'm really grateful. And I want people to know this because it bolstered my sales. Bolstered my sales as in the SAILS. So it really helped the ship afloat, keep the ship afloat. And every time you published a piece by me, it really was an inspiration that people out there at least are reading it. So the book is published by the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. A lot of thanks beyond words. Thanks to them for having the faith in my words to actually take it upon them and publish this book of prose and poetry. And it's funny. Growing up, I heard a lot about the great poets from mom and dad, etc. There used to be a lot of recitals over the dinner table about great protest poetry of Neruda and Amilcar Cabral, and all the great poets, Langston Hughes, etc., Pablo Neruda, and Jose Marti. South Africa, the songs of Wisile Mini, the poetry of Brawili Khusetsile, our late National Poet Laureate, our current National Poet Laureate, Mongani Wale Sirote, the words of Steve Biko, the writings and all the other anti-apartheid and anti-colonial struggles that were still taking place at the time in the early 70s. So, but the book has been structured thematically. So it's called Struggle, Exile, and Verse. I always am at pains to say that I didn't really struggle because I was born there. All I knew was being in the place where I was, without having a solid reference point to South Africa as a physical place. I always was told about the family, my uncles, my aunts, my mother's side especially, who were to the hilt, struggle. It was a struggle family. My grandfather was Baji, we call him Maulvi Sluj. He was president of the TIC and the Transvaal Indian Congress, banned, arrested way back in 1946. So it was a family on my mom's side of pure struggle. Maternal grandfather was hardly ever at home. 10 children to bring up by my grandmother in a small little house, the couple, only maybe 2 bedrooms. But coming back to the book has been really, it's been an honor for me to have it published by the Kathrada Foundation. Thematically, struggle, exile, love. Struggle, more about the struggle that I felt, I saw within my parents, that I saw with comrades that came and went, with reading of books like Comrade Indris Naidu's Island in Chains, and the SWAPO writings, the Polisario writings, the Frelimo writings, Franz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Agostinho Neto, and poets all across the world. And so most of the poems on struggle, not my personal struggle. It's more about trying to understand what the struggle was for the people who were at the forefront, because I was far too young. Exile, again, as I am always at pains to say, I was just born there, so I can't count myself an exile because I was born there. And when we came to South Africa, it was of course lots of love from the maternal side of my family and the paternal side as well. And when it comes to love, moving around, it's not easy to have any long relationships, etc., etc. So the idea of love is, like I say, it's more like an idea, a little composite thing that's there, that when you read all the great romantic poets and all that, the yearning for love more than anything else, rather than a single person or a couple of people. So it's more in an overarching way, So that's where struggle, exile, and love, the title comes from. Yeah.
And your poetry reflects on life under apartheid, like you said, and the struggle of oppressed people. Why is it so important for you to reflect on the past in this format?
Well, I'm not very good of a prose. I'm not very good at prose. I like to rhyme, as I always, whenever I send you a piece, I always talk about my scribbles. I just felt, since I was young, my parents, especially mom and dad, both mom from a more of because my maternal grandfather was a poet. He was fluent in so many languages, and he inculcated in my mom a love of protest poetry. My dad, of course, being an ANC, also the protest poetry across the world. Langston Hughes, the words of Reverend Martin Luther King, in Africa itself, as I said earlier, Agostinho Neto, Amilcar Cabral, Wole Soyinka, all these greats. So the reason I think I took to poetry to express my feelings about the struggle is that I just felt it came more naturally than writing about it in terms of paragraphs and prose. And again, it's more an idea of struggle, having read a lot of the great books by the freedom fighters, the revolutionaries around the world, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere from Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda from Zambia, Sabora Machel from Mozambique, all these great, 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 Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru from the first Prime Minister of independent India. So I found that it was easier for me to talk about struggle against apartheid in a poetic, more in verse, because I didn't live it. I only experienced it secondhand via my parents, the pain that they carried. So I found it more because in prose it would probably come across as too personal, as in I'm talking about my struggle, but through poetry I felt that I could talk about others like Solomon Mashlangu, like Vuisi Lemini, like Steve Biko, like Ahmad Timol, Yusuf Akalwaya, Prakash Napier, Ashley Creel, all these MK combatants that gave their ultimate sacrifice. They were either executed or killed during MK operations. So that's why I think I chose verse, so as not to make it too personal about me, but more about the subject. And that was, of course, the fight against apartheid, and very importantly, documenting the lives of those people whom, unfortunately, history tends to focus on a few people without really memorializing the lives of the many others who. Bram Fisher, Bayes Nodia, beyond. There's just so many to mention, and so that's the reason why I chose poetry as a form of expressing, especially when it comes to struggle and exile.
And according to your book, you and your family met Nelson Mandela when he was visiting Sweden. Just tell us when that was, and just tell us about this memorable meeting that you had.
Yeah, well, it was a very memorable meeting. It's burned in my memory. My father and my mom knew Comrade Nelson Mandela Madiba from the 1950s. I mean, there's quite a close bond because Comrade Madiba was supposed to be the best man at my parents' wedding. Couldn't make it because he was in detention during another time. And when Mosey and Juby, my parents, when my mother was expecting and about to give birth to my eldest sister, Tasneem, Mosey, my dad, and Madiba were in adjoining cells. And according to dad, he said, "Hey, Nelson, man, my daughter, I think, just been told that I'm a father of a young baby girl. Could you give her a name?" And Madiba immediately gave the name, Isithosa name, Nobandla, which means she is of the people. Now, of course, that was during the 60s and the 50s, treason trial, etc. Now, fast forward, of course, to 1990, when Madiba was released in February. Comrade Oliver Tambo had really suffered a very bad stroke, one of the most cruel turns of fate, because South Africa was really robbed of a great, great, great leader in Oliver Tambo. And he was convalescing in Sweden. My dad was at the time the ANC secretary of the World Peace Council, the WPC, which is based in Helsinki. So, of course, Helsinki, Stockholm, overnight ferry ride, great excitement to meet Madiba and all the old comrades which they hadn't seen and met in decades. So we get to Sweden, get into this hall, and suddenly there's Madiba standing in the corner. And I mean, for a 17-year-old, it's just beyond, well, even as a 50-year-old, it's Madiba. But at that moment, the crystallization of all these heroes that one read about, that we heard stories about, and suddenly seeing them in the flesh was something that is virtually impossible to describe in words. And then the getting together, the coming together. I was very lucky. I had a small Instamatic camera, so I managed to capture some of the hugs, the first hugs between Mosey, my dad, and Madiba, Comrade Winnie Mandela, Chris Hani, Madiba himself, Comrade Ahmad Kathrada, and Dennis Goldberg, who just passed away, unfortunately, not so long ago. So it was an absolutely exhilarating, it wasn't as emotional for me in terms of a deep emotion, because I didn't know. I had read about, and I knew the struggle. But for my parents, it was deeply emotional, because here, after 30 odd years, finally meeting your fellow comrades alive and well, and to have that reunion, albeit on a distant shore, but on a very friendly distant shore, Sweden, which has always supported the ANC to the hilt during the apartheid. So that meeting was was it's one of the most memorable meetings that I've had with anyone. It wasn't even a meeting for me. It was just being just being there, as to see this, to see the love and the comradeship between these amazing people, and how the years just melted away. And immediately they started talking about the 60s and the 50s, and it was all reminiscing and nostalgia, etc. So that half an hour to an hour before the real work began was just absolutely amazing. I'm using the word amazing too much, but I mean it. It was absolutely amazing.
And speaking of your parents, you write that your family were not overly religious, and you still carry this strongly with you today. But you write that it's not meant to offend anybody. Just tell us more about your thinking in this regard.
Well, I grew up in a family where my mother was a very devout Muslim. Her father, my maternal grandfather, was a Maulvi, a very progressive man, from the old school of thought, where religion, where his faith was rooted in the Islamic faith, and about justice, anti-colonialism, fighting oppression wherever one, and he was banned, and he was. So from my mother's side, my mom was a very devout Muslim, but never overtly so. My dad, on the other hand, was not religious at all, but they shared a bond that is amazing. Uh, Never did I ever hear a harsh word between them. They never argued about religion, and I grew up in that kind of a home. And my mom never ever really schooled me in the religious side of things. It was always about humanity. There's stories in the book about the the humanity that was shown to her by non-Muslims, by people of all colors, by people of all faiths. And so when I say I'm not overtly religious, I'm not. I do not subscribe to religion in terms of the way religious people subscribe to. And without any offense, I mean, it's just a belief system. So without sounding a bit conceited, uh, I would say that I was brought up more in a humanistic way, more like the spirit of Ubuntu. Accept everyone, no matter of class, creed, color, nationality, anything. No feelings of a little bit of being a little bit superior to anyone. Again, no offense to any religious or any other beliefs. Uh, but that was always drummed into me. And then the other thing was that the school I attended in India was a school run by a very progressive lady, Mrs. Rajni Kumar, who was also of the socialist bent. So in school as well, we were told, leave religion at the gate, come in, we are all in uniform, and we are all fellow students here, pupils here. And the thrust of all the education was on humanism, was on the struggle of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, of the ANC, of SWAPO. And there was a lot of emphasis on that, of what unites us all as people, rather than what unites us in our own pockets as being of different faiths, etc. So, and that I still carry with me, as in more of a overarching humanistic way, which I think every religion preaches, that that love thy neighbor, respect each other. So I think those are the values that every religion preaches, and I see no disjoint between a humanistic worldview and a religious worldview. Of course, the extreme, when it comes to extreme religiosity and fundamentalism across the board, that is something that we are grappling with today, as we see in the world.
Yeah, and in that same vein, xenophobia is an important subject for you, from especially what we see in your writings. And South Africans have been called out for supporting the Black Lives Matter movement while xenophobia is rife in the country. Just give us some of your views on that.
Well, it's a very, very painful chapter in our life. What happened in 2008, when the ANC was banned post Sharpeville in 1960, and a lot of ANC leaders, of course, went underground. A lot of them left for exile. They found safe haven. Uh, People like President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, people like Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, President of Tanzania. These were people who opened up their hearts, they opened up their homes, they opened up their countries to the stream, to the deluge of South African exiles, political exiles, and camps were set up, and land was given to the ANC, material and financial assistance was afforded to the ANC, even by countries like Zambia and Tanzania, who themselves had just come out of a long history of colonialism. So when I see xenophobia rearing its ugly head here, it hits me in a very, very painful way, because uh, I grew up being the recipient of the love, the support of countries where I was not a citizen of. I was not Indian. I was not Egyptian. I was not Finnish. But people, governments, they open their hearts and open their doors. So when I see xenophobia in South Africa, it is beyond galling. It hits me in such a place that's impossible to actually define, because I think of all of our, whether it's SWAPO, ANC, Frelimo, uh, any of the PLO, Polisario Front, any of them, and all of them who were welcomed and who were treated with so much of love and dignity, and that we cannot, as human beings, as a South Africa, a free South Africa, who enjoyed the open doors of our neighbors and fellow Africans, and we just barely less than a generation away from freedom, see this horrible, vehement this xenophobic sentiment on our streets, the murder, the killing, the displacement, the attacks on fellow Africans and others, is something that is disgusting. It's a harsh word. I use it purposely. It is disgusting. The unfortunate and actually inexcusable, unconscionable response by the governments of the time, whether it was in 2008, 2009, or is it really xenophobia, or is it criminal? It was xenophobia. It was simply xenophobia. People were targeted because they were foreign. And when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement, South Africa has, of course, thrown our weight behind it, as we should, on principle, etc. Uh, there will be many who say that there's a disjoint between, on one hand, we have this xenophobic, we have this bubbling xenophobia right at the bottom simmering, the government of the day not doing as much as it should to tackle xenophobia in South Africa. So how could we, or why should we, or what gives us the right to talk about the Black Lives Movement in the States? But that goes back as well to the liberation struggles of so many people and the independent countries. Australia. Australia supported the ANC, South Africa banned the Springbok rugby tours, etc., while having a very, very harsh policy against the Aborigines in Australia. Similarly, in Egypt, in many other countries, they supported the South African movement, the ANC, the PAC, and all liberation struggles, while having their very own, very difficult caste, religious, not just, and I'm not just talking about differences, but serious issues of casteism in India, the serious issues of racism against the Aborigines in Australia. But still, these people supported the ANC. So yes, it's a lot of people go further and say it's hypocritical. I won't go that far, because we do, and the ANC as a whole does have a, uh, a strong feeling about, especially where we come from, about religion, about racial intolerance, about the murder, the barbarity we are seeing on the streets of the United States of America under such a president as Donald Trump, who is stoking racial hatred. And yes, we may not have grappled with our xenophobic issue. We should, we have to, but I absolutely agree with our governments and our countries across the board, religious, civic society, all in our condemnation of what is happening to an African American man who walks down the street and has to turn around because he could be mowed down at any time purely for being an African American. So, in that regard, just like the world came together with their problems, with their internal problems, and supported South Africa, there were people in the United States that supported the African National Congress, in spite of the fact that the United States was an ally of apartheid South Africa. In England, it was the same thing. So yes, there's a lump in the throat. It doesn't sit very well that we don't really tackle xenophobia at home, but we are very quick to condemn the treatment of African Americans, Hispanics, etc. in the States. Black Lives Matter, but Black Lives Matter, and we support it to the hilt. And just as they supported us, we support them, and we will support them in every which way we can. I'm talking about as a people. As a government, of course, we can only keep the pressure on in order to try and nudge them along a way where they can, where the government can finally take xenophobia in South Africa seriously and really come down hard on the xenophobes. And the xenophobes are within us. They are not a distant phantom. They walk with us, they work with us, they eat with us. They are the ones who sup with us around a dinner table. They are parts of our families. They are our sisters and our brothers and our friends. And we have to speak up whenever anybody says anything about these foreigners or this thing. So I don't see a real disjoint between South Africa as a government and as a nation supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's very important. But it does leave a little bit of a hole that we should do more, and we should have done more, and we have to do more about tackling xenophobia in South Africa.
That was poet Afzal Moolla discussing his latest book, Struggle, Exile, and Love.